So I'm excited to welcome you all to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Carolyn Hembree with us tonight to celebrate her latest poetry collection for today. Carolyn, welcome, welcome. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Emily. I'm utterly thrilled to be here. And I just want to thank you. And I want to thank Zach as well and Margaret for making this possible. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is one of our most treasured event series that we have here. And I always come away learning so much. So super excited to kind of kickstart our new season with our chat this evening. Before we get into questions, would you be able to read a couple of poems from the collection so that we can get a bit of a idea of what we might be talking about?
Absolutely. So I'm Carolyn, she, her, Carolyn Hembree, she, her, and I live in New Orleans. I've lived here since 2001. And and so as Emily so generously talked about, this is my third collection for today. And what I'll do is I'm going to read two excerpts from the long title poem, and I think it lands at about 60 pages. So just brief excerpts, like I said. And So I'll open with the opening. It takes place across a single day, sort of Mrs. Dalloway, Bernadette Mayer's midwinter day. And this is the morning of spring day. For today, our gate flung open, every gate in the neighborhood flung open, world at large, world at home, hand in hand, any spring morning. Honeybees at the funnel, cat between our legs, then out of sight. We pass the riverside neighbor's magnolia. We pass the big house with the 100-year-old paint job. We pass the shotgun house with a fresh eggs, $5 a dozen sign. We pass a cottage shuttered till noon. Ah, yes, joy of sleeping in. All the raised houses. Oh, crawl spaces with cool, packed dirt. We pass the butterfly sanctuary sign, milkweed, monarch, black swallow. We pass morning porch sitters. My kid's hand free, her rushing, her lolling. Morning, hot already. Yes, already, yes, spring morning. A neighbor sweeping sidewalk smiles, nods. A neighbor clearing a storm drain, hip boots, gloves. A giant deflating Easter bunny slumped over its carrot. Here, the garden wall of wisteria. Mental note, haiku a day. Garden wall lizards. Rubescent throats throbbing. Turf, love, both. No, rubescent, cerise, carmine. We pass the open window. Plink, plink of a piano. We pass a trash truck, her jumping through sprinklers. Like your bunny ears, my sun hat lifts as if in answer. Hold on. We turn at a pothole turned bird bath. Finch ablutions. Turn onto the avenue at the big church, birdseed underfoot. Wedding last night? How long our shadows. What did I dream? Last night in the rocker with this poem on my lap. Any given night. Nowhere to go, nowhere to get to. A ghost bike drifts, lane to lane, moonlight, handlebars. What did she dream in her high bed? Kiddo balancing on a curb catcher sleeve. What did they dream? Pavement sweeper, porch sitters, trash collectors. What do I know of anyone's inside lives? Door open, look. A whole house under that sunny riot, a cat's claw in bloom. Here, our favorite house, yellow with a great palm where wild parrots roost. We agree, palm trees exist, yes, yes. Key today. I remember how we began, Kiddo and I, naming one thing over another. Last month, we read from Alphabet, Inger Christensen's Apricot Trees Exist, Apricot Trees Exist. So we began to add, letter by letter, day by day, azaleas exist, azaleas exist, bees exist, bumblebees exist, and 3 days ago, Sunday, magnolias exist. Magnolias older than bees, our riverside neighbors. Magnolia. What about today? Palm trees. And what else exists? I'll close this brief sort of intro reading with a very short section later on in the poem after the speaker has dropped off the child to the bus stop and gone about moseying and having remembrances. In August, it'll be the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And this little section is dedicated sort of to my students and in memory of that horrific human-made event. I remember last spring's floods. Not bad. 15 years, more, since the big storm. Storm that reversed the river's course. I remember snow the Christmas before. I remember when they pulled up the levee sheet piles. Corps of engineers shorted us 15 feet. Felt right nobody would have drowned. I hope my student was too drunk to feel himself drown. Thank you.
For not only reading such a beautiful excerpt from that long poem, which I'm so excited to talk about, but for also picking some selections that I think connect to a lot of those moments of inquiry that myself and possibly others in the audience might have some good questions for too. Beautiful. Some of my favorite moments were in those excerpts you read, especially about your student. As a teacher myself, I think we can all feel that emotion there. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Before we give you the hard question, could you tell us just a little bit about who you are? Maybe we'll start easy.
Okay. So I'm Carolyn Hembree. I'm a professor in the MFA program at the University of New Orleans. I've lived here since 2001. I was born in East Tennessee in a place called Bristol, which is a split city. It's in, I guess, twin cities, Bristol, Tennessee, and Bristol, Virginia. And those are a few things about me. Yeah, anything else I'm willing to share within reason.
Great. No, that's great. It's always good to get a sense of, where you're coming from and some different things that might be tossing around for our questions. All right. So our kind of starter question can be a little bit tricky, but I think it's good to get us to think about this idea of craft. And since this is a craft chat, we'll talk about that. Sorry, my cat is having a little cough in the background, so you hear her. I do apologize. They always seem to pick the moment when you're unmuted and on camera to to do their nonsense. But
Well, it's poetry, so if there's not a little nonsense from the feline community, then I'm not sure we're fully engaged. So I love it.
awesome. We'll take that. We'll have to incorporate this into future craft chats as well. But our question for you is, where does thinking about the craft of writing fall into your own process? Or when you're writing, when are you most aware of those more kind of mechanical parts of the process versus that maybe more free-flowing drafting phase?
That's a great question. I think for me, usually this isn't always the case. The exceptions are when I'm writing a villanelle, which is, and I haven't written many, but when I have written villanelles, those are kind of my gift poems. The poem where you sit down and write it and then maybe make a few revisions. And that's the opposite of my process usually. My process is, I guess, kind of more like a sculptor's, in that I amass material, research, as well as documentary pieces, overheard language, little bits of rhythm or syntax I pick up. And so I pull those and I cull them and I cull them. And so over time, I start to feel the structure emerge, and often the line emerge from that. So I would say that it's usually an accrual, and then later on, I may impose or hopefully see emerge some kind of structure. But I try to stay as provisional as possible and be willing to abandon course at any time.
Yeah, I love that idea, that kind of flexibility or willingness to abandon something along the way. And I think that's a great approach, especially to think about form, which is sort of my next question leads into form a bit, because we see a lot of traditional poetic forms within this collection. We start with that sonic crown. We also get the villanelle, haiku. And then there's some invention, I think, between the pieces of For Today. There's a lot of really wonderful kind of formally inventive moments and sonic play. And then also the sort of Fantasia poems, those more prose poems, thinking about that as well. So what is your relationship to form as a poet? Thinking about what you just said about form maybe coming in later in the process, but how did you kind of find your footing and negotiate that relationship to form?
That's a great question. I think I was exposed, and I know the book kind of deals with this. My father was my first writing teacher, and in some ways, as my husband said, and he didn't mean this in a bad way, but my father was more of a mentor to me than a father in some ways. He was a German professor, and so he would. One of my early memories is him translating Death Fugue, Celan's Death Fugue, and sort of trying out his translation on me when I was, I don't know, 6 or something. So I think so very early on, I was exposed to form as well. And then I think I resisted it for quite some time in my own writing. And then in graduate school at University of Arizona, there was sort of a forms class. And I tried my hand not very well in there, though the villanelle kind of emerging as the form that for me was my favorite. And then I began to teach form at in the program, and I think my teaching form, I felt a little like a fraud for not engaging with it. And so I think teaching it to an extent pulled that out of me to practice more in form. I think form for me is a wonderful revision tactic, especially the sonnet. I think that, and so that's sort of my relationship to form. I guess I would just add to that. Rarely do I put form in front of the material, but I did with the sonnet crown. Though the sonnet is not my favorite form. I do find it, I mean, I love reading them. And I like using it for revision. I like the fact that it's an argument and the sort of built-in pieces of it, though there are a lot of people who are contemporary poets like Diane Seuss and Terrence Hayes who are really flexing the form. I think I'm a little bit more traditional, but I like the fact that it sort of pushes me away from the discursive, which is where I can go. And I like going, but it pushes me into being more economical. And I guess uh, the last thing I was going to say was about the sonnet crown. And that was one of the few occasions where, because it is an elegy and it's an address to my father, who died when I was 6 months pregnant with my only child. And he was an only child and I'm an only child. So there's this sort of legacy of that. And I knew it was an address to him. And in an address, I wanted to reach him beyond the veil, to call him back. And in so doing, I knew, or I felt at the time, that doing so required that I speak his language, or I speak in a way, I write in a way that will reach him. And so that's what called me to write in blank verse for the crown, and also make the allusions that I make that are shared music by us, shared poems, which is largely the way we communicated our emotions, was not to say, I feel this, but to say, well, listen to this piece by Bach, or listen to this by the Violent Femmes, or so that, I guess that's a long way of answering you.
No, I love that. I love the idea of the sonnet, especially as a revision tactic. I find that I work in that way as well. There's something about that compression that form gives you, even if you take it out of that form as you're moving through other revisions as well. So to think about some of the kind of compression of form, then we have the title poem, which is so expansive. So could you talk about that kind of long poetic sequence, maybe in contrast to some of the other forms, or just how it fits within kind of its role in the collection itself?
Yes, I thought a lot as I was, I guess I'll start with the long poem took about 5 years to write. The whole collection came together after 8 to 10 years. But the long poem was the ending of the process, and how it fits, I guess for me, I can't determine how a reader is going to come out at this, but the first section sort of having the sonnet crown to the father, the second section going into the mother-daughter relationship, and the third section kind of more communal poems, and tucking in the haiku, which of course are more objective, and then the fourth one going into this long poem that may incorporate varieties of the third, and it's much longer than anything else. And that kind of imbalance interested me a good bit. I thought about, James Schuyler, his book Morning of the Poem, Snodgrass's Heart's Needle, and I guess more recently Sean Thomas Doherty's The Dead Are Everywhere Telling Us Things. Yes, all of those have this kind of imbalance with these lyric poems in the beginning, or the beginning sections, and then blowing the kind of doors off into a much larger poem. So I valued that kind of imbalance, and I valued, and this was over time, it interested me to have a kind of collision at the end of a section, between forms, but also between content. The last thing I guess I would say about the long poem was just really, I felt when I read this, I just felt much less lonely in my process. That Teresa Hack-Cha, who's one of my favorite writers, and she wrote Dictee, which some will teach as a novel, and some will teach as a pseudo memoir, and some will teach as poetry. Okay, do what you will. one of the, sort of the mother of contemporary hybrid work. Uh, there's in Kathy Park Hong's memoir, it's called Minor Feelings. She talks about Cha, who revealed this, I think, in letters to her brother uh, about dictate, that she literally carried the draft of this work on her body. She slept with it. She kept it with her at all times. And that's something that I have kind of always done. I've always had an instinct for the long poem, even since I was young. And so I guess that for me is a huge part of the process. It is bodily, it is, organic in that way. And there's something about that complete devotion and attention to and the privacy required of the long poem that I enjoy, that I believe in, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm wondering too, when you were putting together the collection and, working with this sense of imbalance, um, did you think or receive any pushback from potential publishers who maybe wanted a full book as a long poem or wanted more of a balance? Was that something that you think about in that process? Or, we can't predict what publishing wants, and that's not a way to kind of write your best art. But I'm curious as to how you sort of negotiated that or fought for that throughout the publication process.
That's a great question. And just full reveal, it wasn't the publisher, my editor, who's the series editor at LSU Press. It was the only time um, getting something accepted happened quickly. I mean, I can't tell you how many years outside of, I finished grad school in 2001. My first book came out in 2012. Okay, so the second book, it took at least 6 years moving it around, getting it rejected and spending money, and it was awful. This one, I guess it was my like, okay, here's your one gift, and this is not going to happen again. It was a 28-day turnaround. So it was,
Mm.
and it was with it as is. However, prior to that, I have readers who help me along throughout the process and see manuscript drafts and whatever. And my readers were dead split
Mm.
between those who wanted the short poems and those who told me to discard them
Mm.
and go with long poem only, though it would be a little short for a full length nowadays, not back
Mm.
in the day, but nowadays. However, there would be a way to use spacing to make it, the white space plays such a big part. And I think, so there wasn't pushback, but it was a very difficult decision. Probably the most difficult decision I had with this book.
Mm.
Um, Ultimately, I decided on the more complex, perhaps more difficult, riskier decision, uh, and ultimately the book I wanted to read. I
Mm.
wanted the book I would want. So, but it's definitely not, there are readers who lean more into the long poem, but then there are readers who like kind of my favorite feedback, I guess, is, or one of the things that's meant the most to me, and it was like affirming to have created, kept all the sections, was um someone read the book that I didn't think would necessarily connect with it. And then he wrote me privately an email saying that the sonnet crown, which it collages a lot of material and from Rilke and so on. It also collages part of my father's autopsy, which I know was
Mm.
rather gruesome and heavy, but it's an integral part of that poem. And he wrote me and said that his best friend had died suddenly, and he'd really been struggling with the fact that an autopsy was performed, which is something
Mm.
I've struggled with a lot with my father's death, though we had to do it for a number of reasons. And he said that that poem brought him a sense of solace
Mm.
because of it made him feel like that was in some way elevated and somewhat transcendent beyond that. So for me, that was the confirmation that, yeah, okay, I made this choice, and it's not for every reader, but that reader counted as many for me.
Mm. Yeah, that's wonderful. And it's such an important reminder to your kind of earlier advice to think about the book that you would be most interested in or that you would most want to read. Because I do think there can be that tendency, right, to chase publishing trends or to chase, well, what's going to get this published quicker versus what is the most important book for me to write or what is most interesting for me to put out there. And thankfully, we have that in For Today, which is beautiful and complex in all these different ways. And so, yeah, I really appreciate that kind of candidness too throughout that. All right, I'm going to pop into the chat because we have a few questions and I'll sort of kind of weave through them. Since we're talking about the long poem, I'll go to Jamie's question, which is, could you say a bit more about why or how the long poem offered a salve to loneliness or how it offered you company?
Yes. It a lot of it was written, especially once I really delved into it. Um, it became an analog. Is that the word for my world
Mm.
and my life? 2020 through 2022 was the most difficult. Those were the most difficult years, the most difficult time in my life. So as it functioned as a kind of escape, a kind of place that only I knew, where it was almost like there were footprints and I was sort of trying to fit my way inside of them, but in a space that I felt more comfortable than my reality, um, which can get dangerous.
Mm.
Because then one can, I think, disconnect too much from reality, which is about when I ended the poem. I was like,
Mm.
this is getting to be an unhealthy, a little sick relationship here. So I guess there was a desperation in that privacy, in a way of trying to find myself again. I don't think I had felt that since when I started writing as in ninth grade or whatever. I'd been writing much longer than that, but started writing poetry. There was a sense that, people say poetry saved my life, what have you. And I've heard that. And of course it matters, but it's been said so many times, it's difficult for it to have a lot of meaning,
Mm.
but it certainly did when I was a young teenager. And I think in that period working with this long poem, I felt that again, uh, for, the second time in my life. I felt like this was truly saving my life,
Mm.
was going into that work. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah. But I like that almost the long poem as some sort of lifeline that you're kind of building, like you're kind of pulling that rope and or pulling that thread and connecting that tissue in a different way too. Um, yeah, that's really interesting. And obviously a long tradition of long poems that you're sort of working in communication with, which is really kind of a nice repertoire to go back to some of the authors you mentioned already. We had a couple questions about the villanelle in particular. So what draws you to the villanelle? Um, and kind of a broader question about the form itself and maybe how do you work within that form, because it is a stricter form, especially if you're working within the boundaries of the sort of traditional ideas of the form, those repetitions, the ways that revision can be kind of difficult with a strict form because you change one thing, then you're sort of in a snowball effect. So yeah, maybe if you could just talk a little bit more about your connection to the villanelle, how you see them as maybe exciting kind of opportunities for kind of working with form, and maybe how you work with the rules of the form in some ways, or maybe bend the rules in other ways.
Thank you. I Julie Kane, who is a Louisianan, She has written a great deal about the villanelle and has a thesis that I believe is available online, where she discusses the sort of origins of the villanelle, and the very dicey and questionable origins of the villanelle, which I find interesting and also liberating in a way. That the form, I mean, of course, all forms start out as nonce and then become fixed over time. And I think of that one as having some looseness, like there's some argument about the meter, but then you see that meter flexed a good bit between tetrameter and pentameter. The rhymes, there are unrhymed villanelles. Mine in here is largely rhymed, though I do enjoy a good bit of off rhyme in this as well as others. I mean, I could yeah, it rhymes loosely, sometimes through consonants and assonants, but a little bit loosely. I've written stricter ones where I sort of want to hold myself up to that. I guess why the villanelle, it's not, to my mind, it's not as forgiving as the pantoum. It also has an express stopping point, whereas the pantoum unfolds forever, which is its glory and also what daunts me about it. It's obsessive, but it's not as obsessive as the sestina, which I also enjoy, but which can send me into, a kind of manic state for days where I'm just ringing those end words again and again. So it's a nice balance. So much of it is already written once you get those two refrains. It's only 19 lines. So you get your refrains and you've got most of the poem or much of the poem down. So I find that wonderful about it as well. So yes, as far as how strictly you stick to it, I'm always going to be for content and veering away from the absolute restrictions of the form for the sake of language and surprise. Always going to be for that. Somebody who is one of my favorite, I don't know if I'd call her, at least her first book is formalist. Her name is Anne Marie Rooney, and she is fantastic. Her first book is called Spitshine, which is largely formal. And when you see her sestina, it's one that I've studied with my students, and it is truly mind-blowing what she does to the sestina. She compresses it, I believe, into just 6 lines. So she compresses all of those interchanges that go on through it. She compresses it all into 6 lines. She's just a magician, just a wizard with it. So I highly recommend Anne Marie Rooney for experimentation inside of fixed forms.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love what you said about once you have those refrain lines, you have most most of the villanelle, which is what I always mention to my students who are normally so averse to form. But I'm like, well, this one, once you get those, you're like more than halfway there, and it's just sort of the puzzling, which is the fun part, how you're building those connections and the sound play and that kind of thing too, and lots of I think contemporary poets playing with form these days, which is, I always love reading a new book, and I'm like, oh, there's another form. It's almost like a I spy, like where the form's going to be. But it's been really fun to engage with them in all these different ways too. All right, so let me see. I know I missed a couple of the early questions. I think connecting to some of the excerpts that you read. So Sam's question is, can you speak about how you elicit or stimulate the reader's feelings? Talking about that kind of evocative repetition in the excerpt that you read, where that kind of this exists, that exists, and how we're sort of passing through the time in connection with the speaker and her daughter through those moments too. So he asks, were you thinking of this specifically as evocative within the reader? Which I think is an interesting question, considering what you were just saying about the long poem, that sort of personal journey within the long poem itself. So however you want to kind of take a stab at that question.
I um I definitely, since I have had an audience, however small that may be, of readers. So since I had a first book, I would say, well, before that, since I was publishing on the page, I have I began to understand what in workshop I would hear referred to as audience. Before that, I really it just didn't make any sense. And there are plenty of writers who never really think about audience, and I think that's perfectly fine. For me, I enjoy a game. I think of it as a game where I'm pulling the reader or listener close, and then letting there be a gap between us where it becomes more interior,
Mm.
such as the mental notes that go through, mental note haiku a day, that sort of becomes a little bit more interior, whereas the poet may pick up on, like, oh, that haiku a day exercise or what have you. And then times where I pull it way out and have a good bit of distance. I think that it's hard for me to know because I can't read my own work, but I believe that tone plays a huge role in my experience as a reader of someone else's work.
Mm.
It's, of course, the voice, I guess, remains there, right? But tone is the sort of shifts in attitude, shifts in ways of thinking. And in this poem, the speakers maybe failed largely, but attempts at empathy,
Mm.
attempts at reaching into, what were they dreaming? These, pavement sweeper, whomever, and then sort of the self-correction of, like, well, what do I know?
Mm.
I think that that's a way of, at times I feel closer to the material, like, oh, I can step into this, but
Mm.
then a sort of self-correction that happens. So I don't know exactly how that impacts the reader, but it feels to me like I'm pulling them closer and then
Mm.
creating distance.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always something so important about that kind of implication of the speaker as we move through poems, which I think does exactly what you were talking about, sort of opens gaps for the reader to become one with the poem or become one with the rhetorical questions, whether they're in the fabric of the language or sort of implicit in different ways. And even sort of the way that we move through kind of the visual white space in a lot of the kind of movements of For Today is also kind of playing with that idea of kind of pulling us in, but then also kind of ebbing us out. Almost like the tide or a flow of water in some way too, which feels very poignant to the space and locality of the poem itself as well. All right, let me see here. Todd has a great question that I think will lead to thinking about some other themes and ideas within the book. So I love the use of Christensen's alphabet. How does that book's focus on language, ecopoetics, and the assertion of a fundamental isness or here-ness? I love those words. That idea of peach trees exist or things like that. How does that book's themes kind of dovetail with the themes and forms that you're working with in For Today? And maybe thinking about how you were able to pull the references to that book in particular, and then all these other kind of references to various literatures and music as well. That kind of interweaving element of the text, which was so fun to move through.
Okay, that's a good bit. Let me think for a second. So I think the the Christensen and the Rilke served as companion texts for me. Uh, they served as a kind of comfort on the one hand, but also sort of uh, the book is in conversation with them. The particularly the long poem is in conversation with both of them. And I guess whereas the the Christensen is sort of, it's dealing with the ontological, the isness of it. This here, this exists, this exists, and I'm sort of in the moment dealing with these things. In contrast with Rilke and the Duino elegies, where there's this sort of existential reaching for that invisible realm, where the angels, and sort of reaching into that agony of what we cannot have, and what we want to take with us into sort of the invisible realm from the visible. So a lot of it very, very heady. And I enjoyed it as a kind of, and it's one of my father's favorite texts, which is part of the sort of tale of it here. And the Christensen is, I think of as more my text. What it influenced me in a few ways. I think the fact that it's also dealing with motherhood, that it's also dealing with eco disaster, and the accretion that works, because she's using an abecedarium, and she is also using the Fibonacci sequence to make this, to elongate the piece. So you're starting off with a much shorter sort of section, and then it goes on and gets larger and larger and larger. And that did inform for me the sectioning of these poems, and the sort of growth over it. And let me think, is there anything else? Oh, it also, in its seeming simplicity, opening with apricot trees exist, right? Its seeming simplicity, it functioned as a fun game between the speaker and kiddo, as they just name what's in front of them, and call up the day. One day a week, it's the A, and then the next day is the B, except we're no longer in Christensen's Denmark, right? We are now in, we're in New Orleans.
Yeah, I love all those layers and the ways that we're informed by text, but then can also transform those texts within our work too. Feels really fresh, and thinking about, right, that kind of seeming simplicity, but the complexity beneath even the simplest repetitions, right? What happens when we keep repeating something, and sort of reaffirming that statement in different ways too. So thank you for attempting that question. I did want to talk a little bit more about place, and sort of get into some of the kind of eco-poetics of the book itself, which I think is really poignant for things that we're witnessing right now, especially in Los Angeles and the surrounding areas, to think about these sort of collective human disasters, which in this book you're moving through thinking about Katrina, but also COVID comes in there. But the place, I think, functions as almost another form, which we were talking about briefly before we let everyone else in here. So I wonder if you could talk about the impact of New Orleans and Louisiana, and maybe even East Tennessee, as some of those elements come in here as well. The impact of place as maybe another layer of form, and how do you sort of bring in these elements of a place within a poem that evoke such kind of visceral either memories or emotions, and kind of balance that alongside what a reader might expect from the place that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know we talked even before people were in the room a tiny bit about that, about place as a sort of formal constraint, which so place is really, if you took everything else away from me as a writer, and I were left with just one thing that I could have, some writers might say voice or song or whatever. For me, it would be place. That's everything to me, is place. So my second book takes place in East Tennessee. Well, I guess you could say in Appalachia a little bit more broadly. And this one takes place in New Orleans. And I've heard people say, well, it's easier to write about a place you're no longer living in, right? Because that sense of memory creates just that distance that can be desirable. And I had resisted, I think, writing about New Orleans because I'm here and I'm not planning on leaving. So what do I do? But shrinking it down to the neighborhood helped me dealing with the ideas, I guess, the cliches, the New Orleans that comes to mind, which is the French Quarter, which of course exists, and our Mardi Gras, which of course exists, but are really of less interest to me than the intimacy and my neighbors and my neighborhood. So that was one tactic, I guess, and I feel that, and yet you do have the streetcar, and yet you do have the floods. But when those are grappled with by the people who speak the argot that's used here, the way we talk about these things and the way we experience them, I believe that it pulls it closer. So a streetcar is no longer just this symbol on is useful in that, if you it limits, right? Because everything about writing is sort of choice ultimately. And so it limits things. So it would be, and I think we talked about this before too, it would be rather absurd for me to have a mountain here or a paper birch. And so because I love place so much, because it's so important to me, I compile a lot of research about place. I like to name the flora. I like to name the fauna. And touch it. Even if I'm writing about a place I'm not in, I'll travel there and I like to carry little totems here and there from whatever, an oyster shell or whatever I might find that I can't be held accountable for stealing.
Yeah. Yeah, I really love that thinking about the impact of place on our work and what you said about it sometimes being easier to write about when we're no longer in a place. But there is something about the presence of being in a place and sort of documenting or almost translating that experience to the page as it's sort of currently unfolding too, which I do find beautiful, even in its difficulties, right? Without some of that distance, as we love to have as poets. Thinking a little bit about translation, because it came up kind of bringing in some references to your father's translations of Rilke and other German poets. But there's also some different layers of translation or things that I was seeing in the text that I found really interesting to think about, these sort of translations literally happening, but also the way the speaker and kiddo sort of have their own language and are sort of translating as we do with kids in different ways. But then the language of the community as well, which connects back to the sort of intimacy of place. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the possibility of translation in any way that you see fit, not necessarily literal translation, but in some of these kind of ideas of translation that become apparent throughout the lines in the book itself.
That's a great question. Well, I guess full disclosure, first of all, I do not speak or read German, which comes in several times. And I think the struggle with that, and my mother was a French professor, my father was a German professor. I can barely read some French still. I used to speak it. And so that kind of difficulty in translation, I think, is at the heart of the book, not only with the language, but the difficulty in translating experience and the attempt to in with the daughter as well as with other people in the community, this attempt to translate experience. The book opens with the elegy for the father, and one other piece that's in the final poem, the long poem, is a pre-elegy for the speaker's friend, V. And I think attempting to translate on some level through their text messages, through the inability to reach V, who is hospitalized and getting a new diagnosis that the cancer has spread, that she has, and this sort of attempt to bring in that relationship is part of the failure of translation. Failure interests me a lot. And there's a moment where the speaker quotes her, and she had said she was curious about dying, the friend who is in fact dying. And that's something that the speaker attempts to understand. It's a way of, I guess, translation, but can't, as the living and somebody who's not close to dying, and also not quite, well, not free of herself enough, the curiosity about dying, she can't quite do it. So I don't know if that answers you, but I think a lot of it is sort of this attempt to translate, to connect, and failure to.
Yeah, attempts. I think that's such a key word when it comes to not just writing poetry, but this sort of project of being a writer, being a poet, these attempts that we put on the page, the ways that we're sort of grasping for meaning and translating our experiences, but also trying to make sense of the other things that we're pulling together too, which I think is beautiful. And yeah, the possibilities of failure, great way of kind of framing that too. Let me take a quick look. We have about 5 minutes left, and I know we've had some questions in the chat here. This is an interesting one from Rebecca. How do you think about structure in writing a long poem, and is it different than how you would think about structure in a shorter poem?
Yes and no. I think that the arc, which I look for in any poem, the arc is just so much more extended. And how do you keep the thing in the air?
Mm.
How do you keep some, not to continue beating that metaphor, but how do you keep yourself aloft? How do you keep some wind under yourself? And that's difficult in a short lyric poem, maybe impossible in a long poem. And I think Rachel Zucker talks about it. It is in some ways, and my teacher Jane Miller used to say, it is in some ways an inevitable failure. And I think that it just can't succeed in the way the short lyric poem can. And yet its ambition is kind of its glory in a way. But to answer you, my readers, one of whom is on here right now, Michael Todd Edgerton, who's a fantastic poet, helped me to think about space, using the field, using moments that are more that give the reader, that are more generalized, that give the reader space to sort of breathe, in which the repetition can do. Marianne Baruch, in her great essay, Poetry's Over and Over, talks about the repetition as a voiced pause. So that's a place, but for me, it's thinking about when the reader can have a break, whether that's through the white space, whether that's through a repetition or what have you. But it's definitely quite a crazy thing to try to keep in the air.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Again, going back to failure in some way to the kind of attempt that a long poem is to be its own failure in some way by the end. Great. I think maybe we'll end with Kimberly's question, which I think is a really interesting one. What's a favorite poetry prompt you use for yourself or offer to your students?
Okay, I'm going to sound really old-fashioned. Um, I love it sort of jumps up my ability, and I see it as the exercise that most sort of all of a sudden will place my students sort of at a higher level, at least as far as like sophistication, is to take a poem one admires and map it.
Mm.
Uh, Basically diagram the sentences piece by piece and do kind of a Mad Lib. Should be the exact same number of words, the exact same parts of speech, and it goes piece by piece. It's a slow process, and it's a process of complete devotion, because one really can't quite publish something like that. I mean, obviously we have influence, we try on other people's styles, whatever, but this is something where it's a direct mapping. So there's no worry about like, oh gosh, I've got to make this great. I'm going to go put this in, poet lore. And you can't worry about that, because you're doing this as an exercise. So it's a devotion to the craft, and it's the best way, I believe, to know a poem. So I try to sometimes incorporate that into my practice, and I also use it, recommend it to my students.
Mm. Such an important reminder to spend time with the poetry that we love, right? The poetry that nurtures us, and give attention to the smallest bits. I mean, I feel like I'm gonna exit this chat and go have to start doing my own exercise. Maybe we'll all do our own kind of homework post chat with that exercise, which I think is it's illuminating in so many ways. And sadly, I'm looking at the clock and we are at our hour. But Carolyn, thank you so much for your generosity, your openness, and just your poetry with us this evening. I feel like I've learned so much, and hopefully our audience has had a good time. And thank you everyone in the audience for all of your wonderful questions, and for being here with us this evening. It's been really wonderful.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily, and thank you for being wonderful audience members. I mean, and offering such really insightful questions. And I've seen some in the chat that I haven't gotten to discuss, but thank you so much.